Howdy, folks. Welcome to 120 Months, the show where we are cruising through the music of the 1990s month by month. I am David Parsons, and I am very happy to be talking with my guest today, Jason P. Woodbury. He's someone who you should know. He's a writer and musician and podcaster. He has an album out right now with a guy that calls himself Dad Weed, which I love. And
Yeah.
that album is called Amassed Like a Rat King. I can't recommend it enough. And he also is the host of a great podcast called Transmissions over at Aquarium Drunkard. I'll put links to all of that stuff in the episode description. But good to see you, Jason. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, David. It's always nice to chat with you, man. Thanks for that lovely intro.
Yeah, is it weird to hear your resume listed out like that?
Yeah, it's weird a little bit, but it's kind of nice too. It's the I like that you lead with the fact that I put a record out because for a lot of people, I feel like well, not a lot of people. And I'm certainly not complaining. Any amount of people who care about things I make is the right amount, but at the same time, a lot of times people don't lead with the music itself. They might lead with the podcasting, which is cool, but my heart is I like making music, believe this or not, maybe even more than podcasting.
Oh, wow. How is it possible to like anything more than podcasting?
I know.
Well, I've been seeing your stuff on your Instagram page lately, including some really great reviews of that album, and I enjoy it. I enjoy your music a lot. And it makes sense
Thank you.
because there's a list when you go to order the vinyl. I'm going to order the vinyl because I'm one of those guys that needs the record. But it's available streaming and everything else. When you go to order it, there's a list of influences. It's like basically like, hey, if you like Tom Petty, and if you like Gin Blossoms, and if you like Flaming Lips and My Morning Jacket, you might enjoy this music. And I thought, God, those are all, and there's so many others. Link Ray, Wilco, and we'll get to Wilco in a second, but it just your music sounds like a lot of the stuff I love. I'll put it that way.
Well, yeah, thanks. Some of that list was generated by James, who runs Fort Lowell Records, and then some of them were ones that we suggested. But we definitely felt like, at least specifically with A Mass Like a Rat King, like we were hearkening back to some of our '90s, touchstones, records like by bands like the Gin Blossoms or Tom Petty's stuff always sounds timeless to me, but the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, those are all good years for Tom Petty. So I mean, um you can't ever go wrong with Tom. But yeah, all those things we definitely reference a lot of that stuff. And Zach, which is Dad Weed's real name is Zach Toporek. He and I share a lot of those influences, everything from pub rock to country rock. And so yeah, and then of course Wilco is an inescapable reference point for any indie rock leaning artist who also sort of embraces roots or
Hmm.
country sounds or anything like that. But yeah,
Well,
so yeah, I'm definitely not shy about being like, yeah, Wilco's a huge inspiration and influence on us for sure.
Well, that's sort of why I wanted to talk with you today because we did an episode that we put out a couple weeks ago about the month of June 1990, when a band called Uncle Tupelo put out an album called No Depression. It was their first album. It's Jeff Tweedy and Jay Farrar and another guy. I have his name somewhere. The drummer. But they're a trio kind of became legendary for almost creating the genre of country rock in the underground, or alt country as it might be called. There are a lot of in like sort of imperfect names for the stuff that they're doing. But one of the things I found out is that there are camps around Jay Farrar and Jeff Tweedy. Like I posted this video of us talking about Uncle Tupelo and found in the comments people were fighting over Jay Farrar and Jeff Tweedy, like who's their guy, you know?
Yeah.
And I didn't realize there was such a split. I mean, it kind of makes sense because it was a little bit of an acrimonious split between those two guys when the band broke up. But then I emailed you in part because I know you're a huge Wilco guy,
Yeah.
and you've interviewed Jeff Tweedy a couple times, right?
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of speaking with Jeff a handful of times, and I think every member of Wilco except for Mikhail Jorgensen, the keyboardist. He's still on the list. I got to get
Hmm.
him. I got to get him. In fact, we just had, or I don't know when this is going to air, but we're about to have Pat Sansone and John Sturrock from Wilco on transmissions to talk about their band, the Autumn Defense. So yeah, I've
That's
I've talked
awesome.
talked with those guys a fair amount.
So yeah, in your email back, you were sort of expressed a little bit of trepidation. You're like, I just want to let you know, I'm kind of a more of a Wilco guy than an Uncle Tupelo guy, and I was like, that's so funny because there's like it's for a band that is a kind of centered around two singer-songwriters and a band that is known for combining genres,
Yeah.
specifically like country and like kind of punk rock. It's funny to, and I guess it makes sense that there are people that have their preferences. Why do you think you're more of a Wilco guy? Is that a product of just when you found the music and what it rings out for you?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I didn't know Uncle Tupelo. I was a Wilco fan first. And I think I got on board with Wilco with Yankee Hotel Foxtrot when that came out. And it was not just like a record that I liked, it was like a really monumental record for me, as we've discussed in the past, you know. So I had that experience, and then I did start working my way backwards with Wilco's records. But by the time I started taking some courses in at a community college in rural Arizona, I that was like, you know, the fall after I graduated high school. I was digging Wilco in high school, and then started at this community college and met a friend who, her name's Trish, and she turned me on to all sorts of stuff that I hadn't heard, and including, you know, she burned me a bunch of Pavement CDRs and Archers of Loaf. And I think we talked about stuff we were into, and I mentioned that I was a big Wilco fan, and she was like, "Well, so you got to know Uncle Tupelo?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I think that was a band that Jeff was in before." And she was like, "Oh, they're like even cooler than Wilco." And so she's like showed me the records, and I think maybe burned me CDRs of a couple of them then, including No Depression. And so, you know, it was a thing where I definitely like Uncle Tupelo. And I think that there's so much uh to dig about the records, particularly as they go on. I think, you know, maybe Jay starts as um, a pretty competent songwriter. I think Jeff grows into being a songwriter over the course of the Uncle Tupelo thing. And I think he said stuff like this himself, you know, that like Gun from 1991 still feel gone, which was the next, you know, record or whatever. That he was like, that's when I felt like I was starting to like kind of write songs that I could stand by. And I feel like uh I kind of hear where he's coming from, but I definitely like Uncle Tupelo. As far as like why there is a divide, I mean, I don't know. Why are there Beatles and Stones guys? Why do you got to be a Batman or a Superman guy? I mean, uh people love a good binary and
Yeah.
love to kind of debate that. But I think that there's another element to it that is interesting to me, which is simply that it's not that Sun Volt, the band that Jay starts after Uncle Tupelo dissolves, it's not that that's a band that never changes things up or breaks the rules. But I do think that, you know, records like Trace, which is my favorite of theirs, they kind of epitomize a certain alt country ethic or that idea of what alt country was. Whereas Wilco almost immediately starts to like step out of the bounds of what you might expect from a country rock band. And I just think that as Wilco becomes more and more experimental, bit more located in, you know what I mean? I liked alt country stuff for sure. Another name for the genre that I always lean towards because of how silly it is the alternative, which I just think is um the best slash worst. But
Yeah.
I guess what I mean is like I feel like obviously Uncle Tupelo is pioneering that fusion to a certain degree, but of the two bands, Sunvolt maybe has stayed slightly more traditional rock type thing, and
Yeah.
then Wilco and Tweedy's subsequent solo work and all that stuff veers off in different directions, while always still also having a foot in those worlds too. But yeah, I think it just comes down to the camps have to be divided, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And then I mean the camps can become really obnoxious and rigid for no reason because ultimately I love Jay Farrar stuff and I love Jeff Tweedy stuff.
Yeah,
But I'm with you in the sense of like I always sort of gravitated towards yeah, Yankee Hotel Foxtrot caught my attention first. But to be fair, actually, I had listened to Trace when in the '90s when my co-host John Lombardo, it was years ago in the '90s, he handed me a tape of Trace and was like, "This is the greatest living songwriter, like Jay
yeah,
Farrar," you know, and I got into that a lot in part because I was already kind of country oriented and I was really young and in high school actually, and I was into like Garth Brooks and Alan Jackson and the sort
yeah,
of like big Nashville country that was out, like pop country.
sure.
And what I loved about Trace is like it took me to a deeper place. Like it took the stuff I loved about country. And I'd love to hear your point of view on that, like kind of what are the defining elements of country? Like what even is that? But there was something about the earnestness and the honesty of country that I loved. And then to hear this guy like sort of take me to a darker, weirder place on Trace was an important bridge, I would say,
Yeah.
into a different kind of artistic sensibility, if that makes sense.
Well, it certainly makes sense. And I guess, you know, the dividing line between what's country and what's not country is just as contested as any other genre line. You know, it
Right.
depends on who you talk to. And I think that people are always sort of, there was a sense, at least when I was younger and when I started getting into stuff like this, that maybe, you know, guys like Willie and Waylon or, you know, the outlaw country guys had a lot more of an allure to me. Although I also grew up listening to like Garth Brooks and, you know, all sorts of stuff like that. Certainly remember a lot of Judds being played, you know, by my
Sure.
mom, who was a pretty omnivorous music listener. So I think that, you know, there was a sensibility when I started getting into records that like maybe the more outlaw country guys who had a slightly more rock and roll sensibility just had a cooler vibe. But it was also around the time of the Johnny Cash American records, which sort of signified a certain tilt towards what you're saying, that sort of darker territory, hinted
Hmm.
at the sort of more apocalyptic or darker sort of tributaries of country music. And for me, it was stuff like Magnolia Electric Co. You know, Jason Molina, Songs of Haya, stuff like that.
Oh
That
yeah.
also it was doing similar stuff to what you're talking about with Trace. And then I also, you know, immediately sort of started taking to bands like Lamb Chop, who also were doing sort of country moves, but very strange, quixotic kind of shapes to that stuff. And people like Richard Buckner or whoever else, you know. So there's a lot of like songwriters who maybe there's like you take a dash of Neil Young and get that in the mix, and then this more Hank Williams informed darkness sort of thing. And so, I mean, I don't know. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I feel like on No Depression, you hear these guys evoking the sounds of traditional roots songs or overtly playing them, you know, in the case of the Carter family song. Um, and I think that they certainly were indicating that um that sort of in the same way that all the Greenwich folk guys were obsessed with the anthology of American folk music that
Yes.
Harry Smith
Yep.
curated. I
Hmm.
think like Uncle Tupelo is sort of saying like we're punks, but we're nodding to this older thing that is like kind of spiritually we're in that same tradition, even though, you know, we're sort of updating it. And while they definitely get credit for, you know, sort of pioneering particular fusion, there's definitely antecedents in groups like the Meat Puppets, you know, or even the Minutemen, who I think Uncle Tupelo most overtly sounds like. But yeah, I think that their incorporation of older country and traditional sounds, roots sounds, probably was an attempt to connect back to what the old weird America kind of notion, you know, this sort of lineage of music that comes from ordinary people and has, you know, a certain bent to it that makes it expressive for ordinary people, that ordinary people could approach it. And I think that you hear that in that stuff. And they're also, they were just so young when they put this record out.
Yeah.
It's like, to what degree they knew what they were doing is probably pretty debatable. They would probably say they didn't know what they were doing, but nonetheless, they really did fuse those things in an interesting way. To the point that when No Depression magazine comes out, I mean, it's named after, named after one of their songs.
Isn't that
And then,
crazy? I know.
well, yeah, and then many years later, I mean, Aquarium Drunkard is named for a Wilco reference. So it's almost like these guys inspire publication titles. Tweedy can't
Yeah.
help it,
Yeah, they're
So
just they're just cranking out online brands. Um,
that's all it is. I mean, and
yeah.
I'm sure,
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Neil Young. I feel like he always comes up in our conversations, in part because he's sort of a towering figure in a lot of different worlds, and I think that makes sense. Neil Young is this sort of genre bridging guy himself, and I don't know if you've heard the album that he did in I think in the early '80s, Old Ways. That's like a straight country album. I've grown to
yeah,
really appreciate that album and love it a lot, even though I think it was dismissed and almost taken a lot by a lot of people like at the studio as just like a joke or a troll by Neil. But I think that's a great, just straightforward country album. And for me, it sort of helps define those lines a little bit, even though they don't need defining, because you can point to a lot of influences of country in all of Neil's catalog. But that album is a straight up country album. And you're like, okay, this is Neil doing like barroom, radio ready country tunes about crying in your beer.
yeah,
And it's fucking awesome. I really love his take on that. And actually, for those that don't know this album, you should check it out because it's got all those figures you mentioned on it. Like Waylon's on it, Willie's on it, a whole
yeah.
bunch of people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, just I started the summer by seeing, Willie Nelson's Outlaw Music Fest, where Dylan's there and he's got Billy Strings there, and so, I mean, in a certain way, like, Willie Nelson was also one of those lodestars in terms of pointing the direction towards sort of whatever real country. But you look at Willie's discography and sure, he's doing Western swing sometimes, but there are outliers too. There's the reggae record or whatever. Like there's a lot of like, uh, he's somebody who also wasn't like afraid to approach other other genres and fuse it. And country, I mean, certainly if we're talking like traditional country, be it a more Nashville brand or maybe the more Bakersfield sound, there's different sort of stylistic signifiers for each one of those things. But just like I think all music, country music is a pretty omnivorous one, and it fuses with all the other forms around it pretty naturally. When I started writing about music seriously, there was still, I mean, a lot of hate directed at the sort of bro country movement, like pop radio country with either trap references or more like arena rock references or whatever, that sort of thing. And I didn't like that stuff either. But when people would say that's not real country, it always would kind of sit with me a little funny because what is? No, nobody can really say it, and it's always been a kind of pop music, meaning that new influences aren't necessarily going to get shut out the door.
Hmm.
And so, but that said, Uncle Tupelo with the sort of alt country, it just opened a lane for there to be um expression that drew on those traditions but wasn't necessarily entirely beholden to them. And I think that's usually what, that's a pretty helpful restriction to be loosened when you want to make cool music. You know what I mean? So
Well,
I think that there is like, and then of course yeah,
I mean, it feels like politics has a lot to do with it.
that's true.
when I'm listening to No Depression, I feel like when people say like, "Oh, I don't listen to country music," it's a lot of like liberal or left-leaning people that are sort of like they want to distance themselves from any kind of like you said, like a kind of bro commercialized xenophobia or Republican Party type stuff. Which I guess makes sense in some respects when the like sort of big popular front of country music for a long time in the 90s and 2000s sort of had that edge to it. But it is very limiting to think that way, I think. But when I hear Uncle Tupelo in 1990, I mean it's a political album. Like No Depression is an album that like they're pretty explicit in sort of identifying the problems of capitalism, and there are even a couple songs in their later albums that like are explicitly like old anti-capitalist songs, like union coal miner type songs, like that type of
Yeah.
stuff. And I mean, even Jeff Tweedy, who I think I sent you that quote. It's a quote I read out on the from his memoir out on our other Uncle Tupelo episode, where Tweedy was sort of expressing like that he felt a pressure from Jay a little bit to like sort of explicitly address politics, and he wanted to write about other things. But I mean, even Tweedy, long after breaking off from the band and forming Wilco, does that Billy Bragg, the Mermaid Avenue album that's all like Woody Guthrie
The
stuff.
Guthrie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it feels like they're whether they, I mean, they must know it, but they're into that tradition in country music that seems like it's loosely connected to the outlaw thing.
Yeah, well, for sure. And it's worth noting that Jay Farrar also did a Woody Guthrie project with a project that new multitudes,
Yeah,
where it was
right.
like him and Will Johnson from Centromatic and Anders Parker, and then Jim James from My Morning Jacket. So, like connecting themselves to, I mean, Woody Guthrie as a country, he's a roots singer, he's a folk singer. But the lines between that and what we call country music are pretty muddy too. So it makes sense. Like it all tracks. And you're right, there is a political edge to it. I like that there's a political edge to it that feels so rooted in, again, what I had mentioned about these guys being so young. They're articulating the sort of scenes of desperation around them in a small, shitty town where not a lot's going on, and everybody is, drunk or otherwise drugged as a way of just like getting through existence. And I think, maybe, I mean, as a kid myself growing up in a pretty small rural Arizona town, I also had that sort of like inherently dim view from the perch of my youth. You know what I mean? Of
Of
just like,
course.
this world is crap, and this is like a bad scene. But there's truth to it too. They're calling it out with fresh eyes, basically, just due to their youth. And so, yeah, and I do think that like Jeff, you get the sense. I mean, there's the camp, right? Jay or Jeff. But then even for Wilco fans, you've got people who have little camps too, right? Where it's like, uh, I know a lot of Wilco fans who don't really appreciate post Jay Bennett era because Tweedy is more or less the sort of driving force at that point, in a way where he already was, obviously, during records like Summer Teeth, where Jay has like a pretty big, the other Jay Bennett has a pretty big hand in the production and the sound. But I've had people sort of, they don't view Wilco as a full sort of democratic band where it's like a combination of
Hmm.
creative forces that are maybe not fully equal, but more equal, as it is the case with Uncle Tupelo, right? Where they're both writing songs, they're both co-writing songs together. And so I think that like you can get the sense that like Jay Farrar was directing Tweedy a little bit more in Uncle Tupelo, and then as he goes on, he also articulates political views throughout Wilco records, but they change and they are sometimes more oblique and a little bit less direct, is what you hear
Yeah.
on like the Uncle Tupelo things, right? He starts embracing a little bit more um his poetry becomes a little bit more abstracted as his time goes on, which I think is cool, I mean, and seems to have really suited him well. Whereas Jay, again, very poetic, but maybe a little more straightforward than
Yeah.
Tweedy lyrically. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And that's part of what I wanted to talk with you about too, in terms of, you're a musician, you just put out an album with another dude. Like what is it like to co-write music, and how does that really work? Because, with Jay and Jeff Tweedy on the Uncle Tupelo albums, it feels like they're sort of trading off writing.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's just like one writes their song and the other writes their song, and then they like you listen to these albums and you get a Jay song and a Jeff song. You don't really get a mixture as much. That's what's sort of, I think, wonderful about the last song on No Depression. They sing together and you sort of feel the melding of the project
yeah.
a little bit more. But it feels like that's part of almost the problem, or the inevitable problem with Uncle Tupelo that was going to break them up, is they weren't really on the same page. They have defining styles and approaches for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and when you're young, I mean, it's so funny because it's not just the good qualities of a partnership that shape it. It's also the complications and the struggles, like you're saying. So, I mean, would Uncle Tupelo records sound as cool and as good if they had actually sort of understood what they were doing together? You know what I mean? I don't know. Sometimes the clash of that is what creates some of the artistic power. Um, but what I can say about my own experiences collaborating, specifically on the Amass record with Zach, is that those were sometimes I would have parts, a little bit, or I'd have a song idea or two or three verses and a chorus or something like that. But a lot of the songs were just us starting from scratch and writing them, sort of writing and arranging them and writing the lyrics and all of that stuff sort of all at once, in like, just we weren't really super intending to do anything. We just would show up and kick around ideas, and then something would start developing. We'd chase it down. And at first I think we thought maybe we're making some music for my future projects, and then we're making some music for his future projects, and that they would be released sort of individually under those two different names. But as I started reflecting on the nature of the collaboration and how tightly we were intertwined in creating stuff, where I was like, I don't think that this song would sound, it wouldn't be the same song if you hadn't done all these things and if I hadn't done this. And so to us, it felt very important to designate that this was a thing that we both did, because it felt different than something we would do individually. And I think that that bears out with Uncle Tupelo for sure, in that it it doesn't sound exactly like Sun Volt, and it doesn't sound exactly like Wilco. It's definitely these two creators kind of locked in, maybe slightly a creative struggle. Again, a thing that is very, very easy to do when you're in your 20s, right? Is sort of
Mm-hmm.
creatively tussle with another individual. But I just saw he's obviously doing like a ton of those a ton of press for the lowdown. But I saw Ethan Hawke talking about there's no such thing as your favorite Beatle. He was
I
doing
did
that
see
on
that.
subway
Yeah.
tapes.
Uh-huh.
And I think that what he's talking about there, the nature of a group, like you don't ever hear about John Lennon if it's not for Paul McCartney. And maybe the guy you want to talk about the afterlife with is George, but Ringo's the guy you want to just hang out with. But it's all of these guys together that create that thing that is the Beatles, and that is an artistic sort of assemblage far beyond any one of them individually. And I think that that's the nature of collaboration when it really works, is that you just come up with something that you would never come up with completely on your own, and it's some of you and it's some of that other person, and it's some of this weird third shared mind hive situation where it gets very, very difficult to distinguish between who's coming up with the ideas. It just feels like you guys are kind of catching them together, and that's, at least that's how it felt for me. And it was the kind of collaboration that felt so rewarding that I was like, uh, I like making music on my own too, but it's more fun to play with another person, you know?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering in terms of that process and thinking about influences. We started out by talking about your current album, this collaboration as an album that touches on a lot of different bands and from the 70s, 80s, and 90s and beyond that influenced you or had an impact on you one way or the other. But obviously, when you're in the studio, you're not sitting there being like, "Let's do a Tom Petty track right now." So how does that really happen? Because I'm thinking about that in the context of Uncle Tupelo as well. These are guys that very much wear their influences on their sleeves. Like they're like, we're doing music that is within a certain kind of tradition. Yet at the same time, they kind of invented something new. And it seems like that's what you did with this album is you created a sound that sounds like you. And yet at the same time, I can
Mhm.
hear little touches here and there of all those influences. What is that
Yeah,
like
I
in the
think
creative process? I know that's kind of tricky, but
well, I think that for me it was a lot about not when something floats up to the sort of top, from your subconscious. Like it's like a Tom like let's talk Petty for a second. Like I've been hearing Tom Petty songs since I was alive. Like there's never probably never been a time in my life where I wasn't somehow hearing a Tom Petty song or another. And uh, so when I kind of am in the process with somebody of digging around for something that's gonna feel good to play musically and maybe get us going, there's a real good chance it's going to be a sort of jangly Tom Petty kind of thing,
hmm.
But at least in the case of this record, we really weren't stopping to think very much about it. So I think that a lot of that stuff that floated to the surface was just stuff that feels particularly um like it shaped my ideas about what songwriting would be probably long before I actually started writing songs. And so I think Tweedy, whose books I like nearly as much as I like his records, which is really saying something. Talks a lot about the act of creation as sort of like surrendering to your subconscious or like letting, you know, uh making taking weird word game type things and connecting these dots and then seeing where that sends your imagination. So I think of it ideally, I think of songwriting almost as like a active collaboration between the you that comes up with the thing and the you that listens to it first. You know what I mean? You're the
Yeah.
song's first listener in a certain way. So I find, at least for me, that like with with Amassed, where it was Zach and I, the reference points, we definitely weren't sitting around going, there might have been once or twice where we're like, let's do an ELO thing here, or like let's do traveling Wilburys on this one part, or whatever,
Yeah.
so it's like
Yeah.
it's but for the most part it was bubbling up without a lot of premeditated anything. And I have to imagine that that was similar for Uncle Tupelo, which maybe has something. I mean, Jay is a pretty accomplished guitarist at this point, but I think Jeff was pretty scrappy and kind of playing from a sort of beginner's mind state. And I think that that also influences what comes out, right? It's just that state of openness that is particularly easy to slip into, I think, when you're younger and
Mm,
being
mm. Yeah.
propelled by the enthusiasm of playing rock songs with your friends. It's like it's a powerful thing. So
Yeah, that I'm glad you mentioned Tweedy's books because the one he wrote that's called How to Write One Song,
yeah,
it touches on like the creative process and him kind of writing out a map of how he does it that I think was probably more of a natural process for him when he was younger, where you're like you're starting from the blank mind, you're starting from the person that's not thinking about it too much and just sort of banging out some songs. And it might be harder to get to
right.
that place when as you get older because you pack on all these life experiences and expectations and you kind of become your own worst enemy in the creative process in some ways because you've got too much in your mind.
Yeah, I mean. it doesn't seem that Tweedy has the problem of that stopping him from making songs. I mean, his last solo record, Twilight Override, is a 2 hour, three album, song cycle. So, um, but I think that part of what makes him, I think that part of what makes Tweedy such a compelling songwriter to me is the way that he doesn't. I don't want to say that he doesn't take it seriously. He obviously does. He's a very serious craftsman of his art, um, but I think he seems to have internalized maybe a sort of, you know, some of his coolest collaborations are with people like Jim O'Rourke. And
Mhm.
if that Chicago improv, experimental avant-garde underground thing is something that you're exposed to, I think you can look at Tweedy and almost see that while he's still working primarily with like verse and chorus and bridge and these like traditional enough song structures, I get the sense that he really does think the well of song is this thing that cannot be exhausted, and that in the same way that Jim O'Rourke can upload, composition after composition after composition onto his Bandcamp page, because his music is ethereal or experimental or noise based or drone based or loop based or whatever. I think you can almost see in Tweedy like a sort of, I don't know, like the singer songwriter equivalent of that, which is like, yeah, no, I came up with like 600 new songs,
Yeah.
and obviously some of those are going to be better than others, but I think you can see almost a willingness to sort of be like, yeah, why can't I put 24 songs out, or why can't I put a 2 hour album out?
Some
Uh
people become masters at opening that channel, and I think that's part of what he was doing with the book was sort of describing how he does it so that others could do it. That there's a sense that I just saw this clip. It's another one of those clips that's like viral around Instagram of the sci-fi writer Ray Bradbury, who said he has a sign over his typewriter that just says "Stop thinking." And I love the clip because he was essentially saying like it's very easy for especially I don't know, people who are thinkers, who are, in the mode of like being a thinker and reader and intelligent people to kind of overthink. And that can be a hindrance to creating anything pure. And I know that might be a kind of a cliche, but it feels like Jeff Tweedy has mastered that ability to sort of shut off that impulse. That can, I mean, in the memoir, according to the memoir, that impulse came out for him when he was young as self-criticism, as just
yeah.
constantly judging everything you're doing and saying you can't do that. And that's I think probably the barrier that most people experience.
Yeah, and it's obviously easier said than done,
Yeah.
to like not do that, but it is true. It is true, and I think that it is, um if you're trying to think of reasons not to do something, you will always be able to think of a great many reasons not to do something. Everything from embarrassment to, oh, this is cringe, or this is kind of stupid, or like these words are dumb,
It's
this melody's
unmarketable. People might
hackneyed,
think that way
this is
too.
unmarketable. Yeah, well, yeah, totally. There's a million different ways that you could sort of sort something into the I shouldn't put this out into the world category. But if you do want to put things out into the world, there is a part of you that has to like accept that the song is at a certain point not even yours to judge anymore, and it has to sort of like be, you have to let go of it and let it go out into the world if it's going to be anything. And I think that that is a thing. I think that the the creative the creative act it's never been more accessible for people to be able to make things and put them out into the world. And with that has come lots of stuff. Certainly it's harder to put stuff out into the world and make money on it now,
Hmm.
or a lot of the ways that culturally we would, reward people financially for creating art that everybody likes or a lot of people like. A lot of those mechanisms have fallen away, but I do think we're kind of living in a golden age in terms of like my niece Kaden is 13, and she'll send me voice memos that sound like great, like stuff that she made on her phone, recordings of songs
Yeah.
and things.
Yeah.
And it's just like this sounds great. Like you sound you're naturally as good at recording what you're doing as I took, 15, 20 years to get that good. And next it's instinctual for her. She has
Hmm.
the tools to do that. So we live in a great moment, I think, for creativity, but a terrible moment for putting unfortunately a lot of expectations on it, because it's like you're talking about, if you put a thing out and only a couple hundred people so much as pay attention or even acknowledge it, that can make you feel really bad in our day and age, because you compare yourself to somebody who's got millions of people paying attention, and so that's yet becomes another thing. Well, why am I even going to put this out? No one's going to care about it. But you have to put it out if you want it to be art. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Or like you can
totally.
make art just for yourself. That's not, I shouldn't say that. You obviously can make art just for yourself, and there's would be nothing wrong with doing it only for yourself. Um but if, like me, you sort of believe that by tapping into the part of you that is essentially you, you're actually tapping into an expression of something that a lot of people feel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I guess that's
Yes.
that's where the motivation comes from, right? And so, if it feels resonant to you, that means it's going to feel resonant to somebody else too, somebody out there, and you just gotta put it out there and see what happens. And I think Tweedy has been a force for uh, you know promoting, and he's a booster for the idea of creativity as a way of just processing the world and feeling good, feeling okay about what happens,
Yeah, I
or maybe
mean,
not okay, but processing it at least.
yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, it feels like, you know, as the band Uncle Tupelo breaks up and Jay Farrar and Jeff Tweedy go their separate ways, and they each have their own careers, and they each, continue making music. It feels like genre-wise, Jay Farrar stays within the kind of country bluegrass register, and that's what he wanted to do, obviously. And I think that, there's in a lot of ways, I mean, we talked about this, me and John on the other episode, that Jay sort of pursued what he wanted to do, despite the fact that it wasn't necessarily there wasn't really an obvious huge market for that type of stuff, especially because he doesn't really fit into Nashville country, and he's not really doing that punk thing anymore, so he's not getting the indie rockers, and it's sort of like, well, who is listening to this, And there's that element, but. Jeff, on the other hand, he continued. There's something about punk, and I know you know this, like that punk isn't just like hard electric guitars and screaming dudes. Like punk is an ethos too, and it's sort of an approach
Yeah.
to making art, and it's got a DIY sort of thing to it. Um, I mean, having spoken to Jeff Tweedy on podcasts, like how much of that is that punk ethos still present in him? Do you think? Because it feels like it's there and it's not in different ways. Because he became such a, I mean, he became such a huge star, and yet he's still, I mean, a little on the periphery. Whenever I hear Jeff Tweedy in public, like in the grocery store or something, I'm always like almost surprised to hear it because it still feels a little underground to me.
Yeah, well, it's like on one hand, you mentioned this earlier, the sort of and I'm glad I remembered to go back to it because it kind of struck me. You're talking about the sort of political connotations of country music, as a lot of people understood it as maybe redneck music or unsophisticated or Republican coded. Uh, I think that the way that a lot of people got around that was sort of the invention of, if no depression or alt country is a kind of bad title, then Americana has become the title that people can sort of classify. Let's call it blue state roots country, bluegrass, kind of music, or music that is that nods towards that, but has some other progressive element, or culturally signifies a kind of progressive element. And so I think that on one hand, will I mean, when 30 Rock makes like Wilco jokes, you know that they've reached a certain strata of, influence, right? And I think there's Queen Latifah refers to NBC as diverse as a Wilco concert or something like that.
Oof.
She's talking, and so I do think that that Wilco certainly signifies the kind of IPA dad, cool, cool dad rock, but it's whatever. So on one hand, there's that there is a kind of respectability that comes with a band like Wilco. But to your point, I think the punk ethos and punk sensibility has never departed from the band. And on the kind of more recent EP, I forget what this song is called. What was that? Was Cool Shroud? Hot Sun Cool Shroud was the EP. I mean, there's just like a straight up it called Livid, like a minute long like math rock noise freak out, that's
Yeah.
like insane to listen to. And so I think that the sort of punk ethos of you can do whatever you want, and that might mean including like a 15-minute krautrock motoric, rhythmic thing on your album like they do on A Ghost Is Born. You can do that. And that's probably not a commercial move. But I think that it's one that felt just like the guys were like, this is what we want to do. And so I think that that punk spirit does still inform the music, even when it doesn't stylistically necessarily sound like punk rock. I do think that there is a kind of an anything goes ethos that is rooted in punk and the idea of alternative culture as like something that will at least, if not fly against the logic of the mainstream, will run counter to it,
Yeah.
And um so I think that that's still a big part of how Tweedy sees himself and his art.
Yeah, I'm glad you
And I
mentioned the word
Yeah.
art because if that, Ghost is Born feels like art rock to me. And I remember when that
Oh,
album
totally.
coming out, when it came out, I was fully locked into Wilco, as we probably all were, because Yankee Hotel Foxtrot had come out, it had been out for a couple years, and they had established them as sort of like these are the edgy guys who are creating something really pristine and urgent and compelling at a moment when the culture is going to a weird place. It was post 9/11. I mean, even that sort of obnoxious, sort of kid rock edge of country music was very present in the culture. And I know that when we get to the late 90s on this show, we'll be talking about rap rock and all and new metal and all that kind of shit. But that's what was going on at that point. And not to shit on any of that explicitly, because I do like some of that stuff actually. But either way, when Ghost is Born came out, I remember being like, this is what sophisticated rock music sounds like. This is like what, and it's challenging, and it does feel like weirdly anti-commercial, even though this was arguably their like commercial peak, I think, in some ways.
Um, yeah, I'm sure, especially coming off of Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, a lot of people are paying attention. And Ghost is Born I think it's a great record, and it is challenging. And to me, it also signified that I wanted to be challenged by music, or it made that feel like that's something art should do, is put me in a position where I don't fully understand what's going on, or like, how long am I going to listen to this drone or whatever, things like that. I mean, it's funny because that that desire for art to have an edge that makes you uncomfortable, you know, that is something that I think has to be protected and nurtured in an age where um our the way we encounter a lot of art is sort of the frictionless social media experience, right? You're very rarely are you going to like be looking at social media. You might be made uncomfortable. That happens frequently, but not in the same way that I'm talking about, where
Yeah.
your sustained attention is going to potentially allow you to access something from this that isn't apparent right at first. And that to me is like the quality that my favorite Wilco stuff has. And then even when they're sort of in the mid era where it's like, just records that I think are good. I think Sky Blue Sky is great. I think the records, almost every record has something on it that I think is worth like listening to.
Hmm.
But there are records that are more appealing to me from the catalog than others. But nonetheless, there's always sort of a still uh at the best moments a sense that like we're going to try something that might throw you for a little bit of a loop and just stick with us. And when we had Jesse Jarnow, who hosts the great Grateful Dead podcast, the official Dead podcast, um I had him on Transmissions years and years ago, and he was saying, Wilco in some ways are kind of like the Grateful Dead in that they tie together country and folk music with an avant edge, um, with a sort of cultural, um, they've created a culture around them in a certain degree that is inclusive of all of these disparate ideas, and sort of created a framework for people to understand, that a band might be country rock one song and then, can the next.
Right.
And I think that to me is just like, that's having that introduced to me through Wilco, and not necessarily picking up on the same currents in the Sun Volt catalog is probably what's made me more of a Wilco guy. But when you listen to, I mean, I will say, just like returning to No Depression, I was like, I forgot how much this album rocks. Like it is a great record. They sound great
It's
together. There's a
awesome. Yeah.
desperation to it. The guitars are just so good, shambolic, and there's just so much to love there. And it's kind of crazy that this was them in their nascent stage, just sort of starting. And
And how
it
long
was
ago it
really,
was. I mean, 1990
yeah.
was 35 years ago. I mean, I wasn't online really as a cultural product just yet.
In
Certainly.
1990,
Yeah.
no, I was 5 years old,
There you go.
6 years old at this record store getting my copy of No Depression in a long box CD. Yeah, no, I didn't. This record, I didn't get it until, I guess it was probably, close to like 12 or 15 years after it came out. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely like that. But it's also that sort of thing where this is a record that I do think you can you can see why it ignited, the possibilities for so many people of taking these forms and sort of fusing them even deeper. And that, it picked up on currents from the sort of, like X, the kind of punk country type thing, but it took it in its own direction. And it was really, really fun revisiting it. And maybe it's going to inspire a deep dive into more Sun Volt for me. We'll have to
Yeah.
see.
Yeah. I yeah, well, we'll I guess on this program because we are dedicated to listening to every CD we can or every album we can that came out. I say CD because that was the form at the time
Yeah.
of the 90s. I know we'll get to Sun Volt and I know we'll get to the second or maybe third album, Anodyne from Uncle Tupelo. But yeah, thank you for listening to it with me, Jason,
Oh
because
yeah.
No Depression, it sort of blew me away. I hadn't listened to it for a while, and it made me remember what drew me to these guys and this sensibility. The hard driving guitars. I forgot like how fast some of these songs
Oh
are.
yeah. It's very, again, young guys just
Yeah.
absolutely barreling through these songs. And
And Farrar's voice is amazing. It always captured me. I mean, if you listen to Trace, for those that haven't listened to that album, you can go put it on, and just the first track will get you right into the mode and the mood that Jay Farrar is cultivating on that record. But I didn't know who he was when John gave me that tape. I thought it was some old dude. Like I had no idea these guys are like in their 20s. Their voices sound so mature and their art is so mature. Despite them being young. And the themes of this album are heavy and dark. And there are some songs where I was just like, wow, like this is sort of incredible artistic statements in a lot of ways. Yeah, No Depression is quite an album, and it's sort of incredible to think that this is like a proto album for both of these guys. They both
Yeah.
go in into really mature directions. Yeah.
Yeah, and if they hadn't, and this was all that was left behind, I think it would still be talked about as like a really, seminal record. But thankfully, they both have made a lot more music, and so this is the start of the story and not the end. But yeah, dude, thank you so much for having me on to talk about it, and it's really great time.
I appreciate it. And I will again include links for all those that want to check out JPW as he is known.
Thank you.
That's your art name, right? That's what you perform under is JPW,
That's the
right?
band name. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Lately I've been wondering if I need to embrace the just the full name for a project, but we'll see where I land on that. There's more music in the works, so we'll
Very
see.
nice. Okay, so check all that stuff out. And again, the album is called Amassed Like a Rat King, which is just a terrific name for an album. I love it. And thanks for everyone listening out there. Check out our playlists, etc. We'll see you next month.